I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
The election is seen as a first public test for Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
Ethiopia's government has declared a short ceasefire in its Tigray region after 8 months of deadly conflict.
Ethiopia, one of Africa's fastest-growing economic success stories, is fighting a civil war while a humanitarian disaster unfolds. Government-backed forces and soldiers from neighboring Eritrea besiege northern settlements held by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, where a brewing famine and a refugee crisis threatens millions. What responsibility does Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed have for starting and for ending this crisis? Joining me today is the director of Carnegie's Africa program, Zainab Usman. We'll unpack what's going on in Ethiopia's halls of power in Addis Ababa, the front lines in Tigray, and what role the U.S. can play in ending the tragic humanitarian crisis and upholding a fragile ceasefire. We'll also talk about what lies in store for this fragmenting nation. Here we go. Zainab, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here, Doug.
So let's start with the basics. In the last 8 months, Ethiopia has gone from the poster child of African economic growth and liberalization to famine and civil war. How did we get here?
Basically, what we have is a political crisis, a long-running political crisis, which erupted in conflict and is now taking a very different dimension. And essentially, you have a situation where Ethiopia is, at the basic, trying to manage diversity. It is a large, multi-ethnic and multi-religious country, and it's trying to work out the most viable political arrangement to really manage that diversity. But specifically, what is going on right now is that there are underlying tensions around Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's political reform agenda to transition the country to democratic governance within a more, I would say, unified federalism, but trying to create that under this banner of a prosperity party. The challenge is that there are ethno-nationalist actors in the country, in the Tigray region, but also in this native Oromia region, which prefer the strong ethnic federalism on which the country is based on. So this has really been the root of the tensions, which have now bubbled over into conflict.
A big part of this story is Prime Minister Ahmed. Western countries were really wowed by him when he came into office. He initiated some reforms, freed political prisoners, and even made peace with Eritrea, earning himself a Nobel Peace Prize in the process. But was this foreseeable? Should we have seen coming that he would lean more towards authoritarianism?
I'm not sure, though, that the roots of the crisis can be traced to just the individual, because this is something that is somewhat structural, I would say, that you have a country which has over 80 ethnic groups, which partly as a result of a constitution that was introduced in the 1990s, has this strong ethnically differentiated regions, about 10 of them, administrative regions. And in the constitution, there's the option that if any region is somewhat unhappy with the arrangement, it can opt to secede from the union. So this has always been quite contentious in Ethiopia, with certain actors and interests for the strong regionally differentiated ethnic federalism, and those that want to build a more that want to take a more perhaps unified approach.
So tell us about Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, the man. What do we need to know about him?
So the other thing is that he is of joint Oromo and Amhara parentage. And Oromos and Amharas are some of the major ethnic groups in the country. Oromia is a region, so also Amhara. So he, with that profile, he held the promise of someone who is young, dynamic, charismatic, who could also unite Ethiopians in a country where you have these strong ethno-regional divisions. Now, the thing is, he came into office in an interesting way, in the sense that he was kind of selected in a kind of leadership shuffle that happened after the party, the ERDF, I think, lost confidence in the former prime minister. So he was not really elected, but he came into office, so he needed to have his own mandate, which is why the elections that have taken place just a couple of days ago are so important to him, to help him solidify his mandate.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is known primarily in the West, I think, for his peace negotiations with Eritrea. But what he also did was initiate some economic reforms that put Ethiopia on a path for growth that made it one of the fastest growing economies in the continent. Can you tell me a little bit about those economic reforms that he initiated and why they were so important?
Yes. So I think it's worth perhaps clarifying that Ethiopia was already on track or on a strong growth trajectory, because this was one of the world's fastest growing economies, since the 2000s, actually. So it was already on that trajectory. But what Abiy Ahmed has done and has been trying to do is to try to liberalize the economy, to transition from a state-led economy to a more private sector-oriented one. And a bit of context here. So for over 2 decades, Ethiopia pursued a state-led model of growth and development, in the sense that many of its sectors and industries were actually closed to the private sector. They had heavy involvement of state-owned enterprises and public investors. And it is a country that has received actually a lot of investments and support from China. And in fact, what is very interesting about Ethiopia is, despite being a strong partner of the US, of Europe, and the West generally, it has been one of the few, if not only, African countries to try to imbibe Chinese approach to economic development, in the sense that they have built special economic zones. These special economic zones have been built with Chinese investments and Chinese construction companies. So they've built special economic zones and industrial parks to attract foreign direct investment from elsewhere, from Europe, from North America, from other parts of Asia, to those industrial parks.
Let's talk a little bit about those elections. As you mentioned, he stood for election along with the lower house of parliament on June 21st. As of the recording of this podcast, we don't have official results, but the international community has expressed some concerns at the legitimacy of the elections, especially given that a lot of regions haven't voted yet, including Tigray. What can you tell us about how the elections unfolded and what they mean for the nation and for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed?
They're very important. They're the first time in a long time that the country is really having an opportunity to exercise their civic rights to vote. And for Abiy Ahmed, as we already discussed, this is important for him to try to secure a proper electoral mandate. Having said that, even before the elections happened, there were a lot of concerns as to whether they would be free and fair, as to whether they would represent a true mandate to whomsoever ends up being elected. But then, very importantly, there were concerns around the fact that some regions in the country would not be able to vote. So in particular, I think Tigray, Harare, and Somali regions did not really participate because of unrest. So the unrest going on in the country is not just in Tigray, actually. But altogether, my understanding is these regions constitute around maybe 20% of the electorate. so at least 80% of the electorate, according to the Electoral Commission, were able to participate in the elections, were able to vote. And, following the news coming out of Ethiopia, also speaking to people, there was actually, number one, a quite high turnout. And there was also a lot of enthusiasm, especially among young people who had never voted for the elections, even though there were concerns about security in the country. So I think the elections are not as bad as we thought they would be, even though there was high turnout, significant enthusiasm among those who participated. Although around 20% of the electorate were not able to participate.
So let's talk about Tigray. What's so important about the Tigray region, briefly, that is key to understanding this broader conflict?
So it is the home region of Tigrayans, predominantly an ethnic group, although there are also other minority groups there. It comprises around 6% of the population of Ethiopia. But it is also the home region of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, which conducted guerrilla warfare decades ago, was able to overthrow the Derg regime, and then assumed leadership in Ethiopia for around 2 or 3 decades until the year 2018. When Abiy Ahmed, in that leadership reshuffle, became prime minister.
There's another player we haven't talked about, and I wonder if you could just briefly touch on them, and that's Eritrea. How do they fit into all this? I know that Ethiopia and Eritrea recently were bitter enemies, yet Eritrea and Ethiopia seem to be cooperating, at least militarily, in Tigray. Can you tell us a little bit about Eritrea, what their interests are, and what's going on there?
So Eritrea and Ethiopia used to be one country before partition happened, and they separated. And then there was a war in the late 90s until I think the early 2000s. And relations between the two countries were very sour for most of the 21st century. Again, until Abiy Ahmed came into power in 2018, when he made significant efforts at mending relations with Eritreans among many aspects of his political reforms. So he restored formal diplomatic relations. That was actually one of the things that earned him a Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. And, he restored commercial flights to Eritrea, made a visit, and all of those things. But then also when I think his own, he began to experience even more challenges at home, especially in Tigray, but in other regions. Perhaps he may have looked to Eritrea to try to help him shore up his own base militarily. Of course, with the conflict in Tigray, Eritrean forces were involved and perhaps are still somewhat involved, although they've started to withdraw based on news reports.
After we come back, Zainab and I will talk about the humanitarian situation in Tigray and whether the West and the U.S. have any leverage to uphold this fragile ceasefire and facilitate an end to this conflict.
It's released these videos and a report. It says on the 28th of November last year, Tigrayan militia and civilians tried to fight back.
More than 2 million people have been displaced in the region. There are hundreds of thousands facing starvation.
The pressure is building on the man who runs this country, with the US threatening sanctions linked to the situation in Tigray. But one of
Let's talk about the humanitarian situation in Tigray. By all accounts, there's violence, including sexual violence at the hands of soldiers. There's famine. It's being well reported in the media, but what is the Ethiopian state saying about this? And is all of this really a calculated effort by the Ethiopian government to wipe out the Tigrayan people?
So let me start from the last part of that question. I've not seen any evidence that the government is trying to wipe out the Tigrayan people. I mean, what's going on in the region is quite egregious. It's unfortunate. Reports of human rights violations and sexual violence, they're all very harrowing. And unfortunately, this is what tends to happen with wars and conflict. And this is why, it's one always would want to see conflicts, crises being resolved diplomatically before they erupt into conflict and violence. These human rights violations are being perpetrated by soldiers from the Ethiopian army, from the Eritreans who have made incursions into Ethiopia itself, and then also from some of the TPLF fighters themselves. So, it's quite messy, I would say.
Let's turn to the U.S. and the international community for a second. Before we get through options, I think everyone agrees that the humanitarian need in Ethiopia alone is reason enough to stay engaged and to try to stop the violence and especially ease the famine. But there are a lot of national security realists listening to this podcast. So can you explain briefly what the U.S. national interest is in being engaged with Ethiopia beyond the humanitarian crisis?
Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa with a population of 110 million people. It is an important actor in the whole of Africa. And what happens there matters for that sub-region and indeed for the whole continent. So it's a large, diverse, and strategic country, I would say. But also you look at the relations between the US and Ethiopia, the relations have actually been strong for the past couple of decades. So the country itself, by its profile, its location, is quite strategic. So the second reason I would say is that this is a country that, for historical reasons, all of that, has been a large recipient of foreign aid from the US. So in the year 2019, it was the largest recipient of US foreign aid in Africa, to the tune of nearly $1 billion, actually. I think the precise figures are $922 million. So that's the second reason. It's a major recipient of US development financing. Third reason is that there is actually a substantial Ethiopian diaspora population in the USA, especially in where we both are, in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia axis.
I'm a big fan of their cuisine, so I know that
yes.
well.
All the Ethiopian restaurants in DC. And there are certain industries in DC. You pay attention to service industries, and you see a lot of Ethiopians and some Eritreans too, people of Eritrean origin, but mostly from Ethiopia. Then I guess a fourth reason is that, as I mentioned earlier, the location of Ethiopia in the Horn and its role there is quite strategic. And for that reason, you find that the US has taken a very, very strong interest in what is going on.
So you mentioned reasons why the U.S. has vital interest in Ethiopia, and I'm certainly convinced. I wonder, does the U.S. or the international community have leverage at all that they can use to try to mediate an end to the conflict in Tigray or otherwise create a diplomatic solution for this ongoing battle?
I think what would work in Ethiopia would be a more multi-pronged and multifaceted approach. So to respond to your question directly, I think sanctions can be useful on certain fronts, perhaps when they target specific individuals, and if there is confidence that by targeting those individuals, certain actions can be expected from them, or certain behavioral changes can result from those actions. And how do such behavioral changes happen? So if visa restrictions have been imposed on people who travel frequently to the USA, or who have people with families living here, or with children, then potentially that could be effective. But if sanctions are imposed on people who maybe travel to the US, I don't know, once every few years and conduct most of their personal businesses, go on vacation to Dubai or Singapore, and a lot of Ethiopians go to Dubai and Singapore actually, then you have to wonder whether those sanctions would induce those behavioral changes that are expected. But more broadly, because the sanctions are not just on individuals, there are also efforts to restrict financial flows. Those could potentially be effective in inducing that behavioral change in the short term.
So sanctions may or may not work, but you sound somewhat skeptical based on other situations. So tell me what you think a smart U.S. policy for Ethiopia would look like to address this current crisis, and also just for a better relations between the U.S. and Ethiopia.
I do believe that the U.S. should strive to take a more regional-oriented approach to help negotiate a political solution in Ethiopia, because ultimately that is probably what will bring an end to what we're witnessing in the country. And such a regional approach should involve the African Union. Now, the African Union is an interesting actor and entity here. There are valid concerns that people have that the African Union has not really pulled its weight, has not been pulling its weight throughout. So I think this is where the US can come in to really nudge the African Union to take a more proactive role. And specifically, I think through the mechanism of people referred to as elders on the continent, so former statesmen, former presidents who have a lot of credibility, who conduct elections, monitoring exercises, quite a number of them. There are those individuals who can actually go and speak with Abiy Ahmed, go and speak with key actors in the TPLF, bring them to the table and try to get some kind of political solution to this crisis. Because in the end, we don't want another Libya in Africa. The continent cannot afford to have another state collapse.
As you mentioned, Ethiopia is a very strategically located country. It's also a very populous country with a relatively large economy. With a civil war displacing 50,000 or so Ethiopians fleeing to Sudan and many more potentially to follow, what are the regional implications for the Ethiopian crisis?
So this conflict has a lot of implications for not just Ethiopia, but the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and actually the entire continent. Because we discussed earlier, this is Africa's second most populous country. It is multi-ethnic, it is multi-religious. And in a sense, what you have happening in Ethiopia is somewhat of a microcosm for other diverse countries across the continent. So this is really an important country. If the crisis is not resolved, if the conflict persists, it could engulf the entire Horn of Africa. This is not an exaggeration. There's also the symbolic implication of what happens in Ethiopia for the rest of Africa. In a way, the country symbolizes Pan-Africanism because it hosts a number of continental organizations. The headquarters of the African Union. It hosts also the agencies of the African Union, such as the Africa CDC, which has actually been quite effective in coordinating African countries around COVID-19. Then it also hosts the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, which has historically been this interesting entity that comes up with very heterodox, very Pan-African approaches to thinking about industrialization and economic development. So it is significant on that front, and if it gets to an untenable situation in which, we no longer even have an Ethiopia standing, then, this is going to be a heavy blow to Pan-Africanism on the African continent.
You said Ethiopia is such an important country, not only for the region, but for the whole continent. Right now, we've heard that there's a ceasefire in Tigray and potentially an opening for some sort of fragile peace negotiations to go forward. And yet there's still a lot of problems, as you mentioned, and a lot of issues baked into Ethiopia with such a diverse country stitched together with a constitution that emphasizes ethnic self-determination. So I'll ask you this before we let you go. Where does Ethiopia go from here?
It is tough to forecast where Ethiopia is headed. I guess what I'll say is I hope cool heads prevail right now to really bring an end to the conflict, to violence, to have some kind of negotiation of a political solution, and to put the interests of the country above individual, sectarian, and priorities.
Zainab Usman, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Good to be here.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.